Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and good evening. Welcome to Istanbul, Turkey. On behalf of our sponsor, we are based at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University. This is CIGA, Center for Islam and Global Affairs. This is CIGA's third international conference on Islamophobia, examining the global war on terror, challenges, policies, and consequences. This is the final session in what has been a very lively and engaged panels with interesting and serious questions and answers. Tonight's session, again, the final session, the topic is a conversation with the victims of the war on terror. We all know that Islamophobia is evil, biased, and it destroys families, it destroys lives, it destroys nations. And tonight is a small portion of seeing some of the effects of this. Our session moderators will be Asim Qureshi and Linda Hayoki. Asim Qureshi is an attorney. He studied law and has a LLM in international studies as well. He completed his PhD additionally in international conflict analysis from the University of Kent. He's research director at the advocacy group CAGE, which is based in the United Kingdom. Since 2003, he has specialized in investigating the impact of counterterrorism practices worldwide. He is actively involved since 2010 in advising legal teams involved in defending terrorism trials in the US and at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Our other moderator this evening is Linda Hayoki, who has graduated in 2011 with a master's in language, culture, and translation from the University of Mainz, Germersheim, Germany. She's been a professional officer at the Islamic Cooperation Youth Forum, and we are honored that she was a senior research associate here at CIGA, and now she's a non-resident senior research associate. Thank you, Linda, for continuing with CIGA. Her current focus now is on Islamophobia and Muslim minorities. She's pursuing her PhD at Ibn Khaldun University, which is also here in Istanbul, Turkey. And her thesis is on Finnish Muslim converts' experiences on Islamophobia. She has also been selected as a board member of European Forum of Muslim Women, and she probably speaks more languages than most UN ambassadors. We have a very qualified moderators. I will turn it over to Asim Qureshi. Thank you, Asim, for joining us for the final session.
Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And good afternoon from here in the UK, although I'm sure there's many other time zones already in this call. It's really my honor to be co-moderating this final session with my good friend and colleague, Linda Hayoki. The reason why this last session is so important is because this is about the survivors, about people who have experienced the war on terror directly in their lives in different ways, and how they have in so many ways overcome the challenges that they've faced. And so I'm not going to make this too long. I'm going to go straight into introducing the first of our panelists. We're going to introduce them one by one. They'll have about 4 to 5 minutes each to speak, and then we'll open up the discussion more generally, inshallah. So the first person I'm going to introduce is my good friend and colleague, Mazin Beg, who is a British-born Muslim and former Guantanamo Bay detainee. He's also the outreach director of our organization, CAGE. And after his release, he has really gone on to become one of the most prominent and prolific public speakers and Muslim advocates for justice and dialogue. So Mazin, if I could ask you to please give us just a few minutes that helps to set the scene for your story, really, and why you're here.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, and thank you and for everyone for inviting me to speak at this most prestigious event this evening, even if it is remotely. Of course, for me, my experience of Guantanamo is essentially what's put me onto this stage. But it's what I've done after that Guantanamo experience that was probably most unexpected to my captors and probably the community that was around me. They didn't expect, for example, that I was, people have said that I set up a cage in 2003, which would have been a bit difficult because I was actually in a cage at that time in Guantanamo. But as they say, never let the facts get in the way of a good story and demonization. But suffice to say that when I returned home from Guantanamo, I found an organization, Cage Prisons at the time, and Asim, amongst others, was campaigning for the closure of Guantanamo. They had listed, they had the most comprehensive listing of prisoners in Guantanamo from anywhere, and were a portal, an information portal of all of the prisoners, and a connection between the prisoners' families, the lawyers, and the activists. And so from that, it became, from being an organization that gave me, as a former prisoner, a place to look at other prisoners that I didn't even know when I was in Guantanamo. I started finding out from Cage and Cage Prisoners. Very quickly, I gravitated toward the organization and became a part of it. So, since that time till now, almost 16 years, I have been telling a similar story, which Asim has heard many, many times. But every year there is an addition to it. That addition has to do with laws and wars on terror. So the wars on terror are launched abroad. The laws on terror are applied here in our homelands. And as a result of that, the alienated community abroad becomes the alienated community at home. And that is what we have seen over the past 16 years, with almost every year a new law being implemented, almost a Guantanamoization of the war on terror across the board, not just in Guantanamo. So my story really has been told so many times, I'm really tired of telling it. And it's now come to a point after almost 16 years that finally, I'd say, that the story of Guantanamo has really hit the mainstream in a way that I think it hadn't. And that was with the release recently of the film called The Mauritanian, which is about the experience of Mohammed Walid Salahi from Mauritania, who was held in Guantanamo for 14 years without charge or trial. Just think about that. Most of the people I know now and I'm connected to from around the world have been in Guantanamo for a decade and a half, at least. And their stories inform me now as being a former Guantanamo prisoner and campaigning against it. Recently, myself and several former Guantanamo prisoners who are all published authors wrote a letter to President Joe Biden. It was published in the New York Review of Books, and we offered in that letter an 8-point plan for Biden to close down this prison and torture camp and to do what other presidents couldn't do. So this is where we've left it at the moment, and there is a movement now, a revitalization of the whole Guantanamo discussion, and that isn't because of any activists or because of lawyers or even family members. It's because of the survivors themselves coming out and actually telling and putting down on paper and in word and deed what happened to them. Had they remained silent, everybody else would have said that Guantanamo isn't such a terrible place. So it is to their conviction and their courage that I give credit.
Jazakallah khairan for that. Yeah, that was a great start to this, I think, because I think there's going to be a lot of resonance with what others say. Linda, if I could pass it over to you, please, to introduce our next speaker.
Yes, thank you so much. The next speaker that we are hosting tonight is Mariam Abu Ali. And she graduated from Georgetown University with a major in government and a minor in Arabic. In 2017, she completed her certificate in nonprofit management from Duke University. Mariam has been advocating on behalf of her brother, Ahmed Abu Ali, a victim of torture and extraordinary rendition and a US political prisoner for 18 years. Mariam, please share us your story.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Assalamu alaikum, Linda. It's good to see you. It's really hard to hear that I mean, the fact that it's been 18 years, it just feels unreal. But to start with, my brother Ahmed Abu Ali was born in the US, raised in the US. He's my oldest brother and the eldest of 5. Just like many practicing young Muslims, he had a love for his faith and for Islamic studies. And in 2002, he decided to he actually was given a scholarship to study at Medina University. So a year later, in June 8th of 2003, Ahmed was detained by the Mabahith. He was he was in the midst of an exam when he was detained by them, and he was interrogated for 47 days. He was sleep deprived, he was shackled, he was beaten, he was whipped. He was threatened with beheading and amputation. He was shown pictures of his family members and threatened with their safety. And so after 47 days of being tortured, he was coerced into reading a confession. So this confession was videotaped, and this became the cornerstone of the US prosecution against him. So despite the fact that, they had this confession on tape, Ahmed remained in Saudi custody for nearly 2 years without charges. And in that time, while he was interrogated, the FBI actually was present at a certain point, and they observed the interrogation through a two-way mirror. And a few months later, they actually conducted their own interrogation with him. During that interrogation, he specifically requested an attorney, and he let them know that he was mistreated by the Mabahith, after which the Saudis punished him for quote unquote making them look bad, and he was beaten and shackled again. So again, he remained in Saudi custody despite this confession without charges. And at that time, my family was frantically searching for answers, contacting the embassy, the State Department, our senators, and Congress persons. And we just were really given no answers. It was this game of hot potato where the US officials would say that this was a Saudi case, and the Saudi officials would tell us that this was an American case. So a year later, and actually during that time, we had FBI officials specifically tell us in email that they had no interest in Mr. Abu Ali. In another email, it was, we have no further interest in Mr. Abu Ali. My family met with the State Department, and they told them that there was no active investigation, and that they were given that the Saudis were ready to release him. And so we waited and waited, and he was never brought home. And so my family, with the help of human rights organizations, decided to file a habeas petition. And so I believe it was in December 2004, so this was 2 years after his detention, the judge sided with us, and he actually ruled that there was sufficient evidence that there was US involvement in his detention, and that Ahmed had been tortured. And he ordered discovery, where he requested any information regarding US involvement in Ahmed's detention. The US government appealed that, but rather than complying behind the scenes, they worked to convince a grand jury to charge Ahmed, to indict him. And so suddenly, 2 months after this ruling, Ahmed was suddenly brought back to the US, where he faced terrorism charges. During his trial, they actually had Saudi Mabahith testify via video conference that they never mistreated Ahmed, that he was treated, in their words, he was given like a 5-star treatment, like he was in some hotel or something. Because the case was highly politicized, and it was shortly after 9/11, and despite, actually, in the words of the judge, Ahmed's so-called conspiracies had not resulted in a single actual victim, Ahmed was still sentenced to 30 years. And the government, we appealed that sentence, but the government also cross-appealed, and he was resentenced to life in prison. From the moment he was brought back to the US, Ahmed was placed under something called special administrative measures, which severely curtail his ability to communicate with the outside world. He was only allowed contact with immediate family members. And even then, it was severely limited, severely restricted. We'd get 2 unscheduled phone calls a month. Mail would take months to be delivered. It was really crippling in every way, and it severely limited our ability to advocate on his behalf, because we could not relay anything that he was telling us in prison to reporters, for example. He could not speak with reporters. So right. It was like this permanent gag order that lasted up until 2018, where, with the help of CCR, the Center for Constitutional Rights, we were finally able to get the SAMs removed.
Thank you. I'm sure that we will get back to this case later on and have lots of questions also regarding the way how you and your family have handled the situation and how your brother is doing currently. Now I will give the floor again to Asim, and he'll introduce our next speaker.
Jazakallah khair, Linda. So my real honor to introduce next Dr. Fawzia Siddiqui. She's a medical doctor and a Harvard-trained neurologist and epileptologist, and served as a director of epilepsy at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. I guess one of the reasons why Dr. Fawzia is so important here for us is because of the case of her sister, Dr. Afia Siddiqui, who was kidnapped from Pakistan in 2003, kept in a period of secret imprisonment for many years before she was finally resurfaced by the US government with a false allegation made about her. Dr. Fawzia will tell us more about the case, but more importantly, Dr. Fawzia has founded the Global Afia Movement, which is an umbrella organization including everyone and every organization that desires peace, justice, and freedom through solidarity. The Afia Movement is founded on principles, not politics. Its goal is to unify humanity behind a simple cause, which is to bring Afia and other unjustly held victims home. Dr. Fawzia, the floor is yours.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, Brother Asim. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for having me. Can you hear me? Okay, good. So I was just listening to Sister Mariam, and for me, it was just deja vu. Afia, it's been 18 years now for us. It seems Afia gets in from one SAMS to another SAMS, and the SAMS just continue. So my story starts in 2003, when I was rounding, doing a patient round at Johns Hopkins University. And I saw on the screen my sister's picture flash. It was on MSNBC, Tom Brokaw's show. And he said that, you know, she's practically with the FBI now. Pakistanis have arrested her. And, you know, it was at that time that I realized that these idioms and these things, they really have some meaning. Someone's gone through that. To me, it really felt like the sky has fallen down, like the world has slipped beneath my feet. I could not move. I just stared at that, and I just excused myself from the rounds and had to just sit down in a corner and take a breath. And then I don't know how I managed to keep myself composed enough to finish my rounds. I got to my office, called home, called my mother, and my mother goes, shoo, don't talk about this, otherwise they'll kill her. And if I say anything on the phone, and so this is when the nightmare began. And so later when I came back to Pakistan, I had to drop everything because every time I would call home, my mother would be totally devastated, and I would call and she would be like at the graveyard looking for Afia and her children, and she was totally not in her senses. So I came back to Pakistan, and then I found out the whole story, that my sister was going to Islamabad to meet with the chairperson of the Senate, and with an educational program that she had made. She had a dream, a passion for education, and she wanted to change the education system of Pakistan. She believed that Muslims are a third world because of their education system. And she wanted to make what she called an evolution. Anyway, she was taking all of that with her 3 children. And the youngest was 6 months old. And the oldest was 5.5, barely 5.5. So, and Mariam was 3 years old. So these 3 little children with her, she was going, and on the way to the airport, she was abducted. Wow. We didn't find out. And today, as we're talking, it is the 18th anniversary of the abduction. And today will be 18 years, 18 whole years, 6,750 days. So anyway, so this was in March of 2003. And then it was, you know, as if she's disappeared from the face of the earth. We ask anybody anything, everybody, it was just a silence. She was just, we're trying to find her. I mean, with all the contacts and everything, there was nothing. Everyone would say, oh, she'll be home, she's been abducted, you know, it's her husband probably, and you know, things like that. But then a year later, there was some news about Afia in the papers, but then that too faded away. And then in 2008, I think it was Brother Mozam Beg's book, Enemy Combatants, in which he had written about a woman, prisoner 650, and the screams. And that brought my attention, and I again contacted all these social welfare organizations. And then Sister Yvonne Ridley, who was with the Taliban, and she was impressed by the way that they had kept her, and she read the Quran and later became a Muslim. And so she went back to Pakistan, and there she found out about Prisoner 650, and she did a whole documentary on 650, and she believed it was a Pakistani woman. And she came to Pakistan and she contacted me, and she contacted Imran Khan, who again called me to do a press conference. And that is how we found out that there is a Prisoner 650. And even though I did not believe that could be Afia, my mother, despite all the threats that we received, and my mother got phone calls saying that if I go to that press conference, then she will be crying for 2 daughters, not just 1. But my mom said, you know, this is a woman who's in distress, Fawzia, you should go. If you're going can help anyone, even if it's not Afia, you have to go. So I went, and then we later found out that it was probably Afia, because soon after that, as if, you know, things started moving, and a whole delegation was going to Bagram in search of prisoner 650, that we get the news that Afia has been shot in Ghazni. And with those bleeding wounds, she was then taken and whisked away to the US. In Afia's case, how did she get from Pakistan to Afghanistan? I'm told that the legal term is rendition. And then how did she get from Afghanistan? She's a Pakistani citizen. She has no green card, no passport. And from Afghanistan, she's taken to the US. Isn't there a Pakistani embassy in Afghanistan? Shouldn't they have, with the Geneva Convention and all these things, shouldn't they have been informed that there is a Pakistani woman? Were they informed? No one tells us anything. And then she's taken to the US. So apparently what the witnesses told us and investigative reporters was that Afia was told that she is set free. She was sitting behind a curtain and she heard American voices. When she heard American voices, she stepped out. She heard some people speaking English for asking for help. One of the soldiers sitting there picked a gun and just opened fire at her. Close range, she got some medical records show 3 bullets, some show 2. Anyway, she was shot, and then unfortunately for them, fortunately for us, so I'm not even sure what it is, but she survived those bullets and she was still alive. And then she was taken to the US in that injured condition, and then she was charged for attempting to murder the US servicemen who were there in Ghazni trying to get Afia back, or I'm not even sure what they were doing or what they wanted. But what I do know is that the picture that you all see of Afia, that picture is coming out of Bagram. This picture is outside the mosque at Ghazni where she had fainted. And this was told to me by Reuters, by the Reuters photographer, journalist who actually took that picture. This was before she was shot. In that condition, could anyone shoot, even pick up a rifle, let alone shoot someone, let alone snatch it from 6 servicemen? Or are we to believe that they were so lax in security that the servicemen just let their rifles, their M's without the security or anything? The other thing is, all the investigation the FBI did, there were no bullet holes that were found anywhere. There were no bullet casings. There was no gunshot residue on Afia. There was no fingerprints on the gun. These are the forensic reports that were presented in court, despite all forensic evidence in Afia's favor, all scientific evidence in Afia's favor. All the witnesses were contradicting each other. Despite all of that, Afia gets sentenced to 86 years without parole in a maximum security mental asylum hospital, FMC Carswell, which is nicknamed the House of Horrors. And there are lots of movies that are made on it, and the kind of mind experiments and MK Ultras and all that they do, not knowing makes it worse, and it makes the imagination go wild. And since then, for the past 4 years, we have no contact with Afia. We have not even heard her voice.
Thank you, Dr. Fawzia. I do want to ask you more about your efforts on Afia's behalf, but let's hear from some of the other speakers, inshallah, and we can hopefully bring that into the discussion as we go forward. But Jazakallah khair for sharing your words. Thank you. Linda, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Asim. Yes, we'll continue with another lady, female speaker, Shafika Atalay. She graduated from Aix-Marseille University in France with a BA in Law, Economics and Languages, and Granada University in Spain with a BA in Translation and Interpretation. before graduating from Brussels University in Belgium with a degree in multilingual communication and international relations for masters. Her research focuses on migrants' rights, stateless persons, and she's an expert in Islamophobia. She was a member of the Collective Against Islamophobia in France, CCIF, before it was dissolved by the French government, not very long time ago, actually. So Shafika, please tell us about in 5 minutes your story and what happened to you and your NGO.
Thank you very much, Linda, for the introduction. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Barakallahu fikum for having me tonight. It is really heartbreaking to hear your personal stories. SubhanAllah, may Allah give you a lot of strength and relieve your hurt. I mean, the CCIF, so the Collective Against Islamophobia in France, used to be the leading anti-racist NGO that fights against Islamophobia in France for almost 20 years. And we were internationally recognized for our work in France when it comes to the promotion of the rights of the Muslims. And but in October 2020, I'm sure you heard the history of this French history professor, Samuel Paty, that was murdered after having showed cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Those cartoons of the Prophet naked. Those cartoons made by Charlie Hebdo magazine. At the time, he was in his classroom and he asked his students, who is Muslims among you? And some of them raised their hand, and he said, okay, so you should go out from the classroom because I'm going to show some things that could hurt you. And so some of them went out, but some stayed in the classroom, and he actually showed the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam naked. After this, after the class, some Muslim parents heard about the story, and one of them was super angry, and he went to the police station to lodge a complaint for discrimination, but they refused the complaint. And so he decided to record some videos calling for the middle school to fire the professor. And he posted his video on Facebook, and then he called the CCIF to complain about what happened. And when he told us that he posted the video, we told him to remove the video because we knew that it would be used against him. And actually, less than a year later, the professor was assassinated by a terrorist. And the French government used this very one opportunity to accuse the CCIF of being directly involved in the murder of Samuel Paty, and they publicly named the CCIF as an enemy of the Republic. And they stated that they wanted the dissolution of the CCIF because we only paved the way for terrorism. And obviously those were false allegations. They had no legal nor factual reality. And the involvement of the CCIF in the murder of Paty was quickly debunked by different media. But then the government had no choice than publicly admit that the CCIF had absolutely nothing to see with the murder. But they said that the CCIF still remains an enemy of the Republic because it creates Islamophobia. It sees Islamophobia everywhere. And above all, because it denounces a structural racism. And you can't say that the state is racist in France. You can't say that there is structural racism because, it's just pure fiction, pure fiction invented by fanatics such as the CCIF. And so the government used the nationwide emotion that emerged straight after the murder of Paty, and they decided to dissolve the leading anti-racist organization that has always played by the French legal rules and that has never done anything but using the French laws to defend the rights of the Muslims. And in an arbitrary way, they dissolved the CCIF on no legal ground, but only false allegations. And it's been a while that the government is eager to eliminate the CCIF because first, we don't follow the state ideology. And you will see that particularly with the bill against separatism, there is a will from the government to eliminate all entities in France that do not have the same ideology than the state one. Macron, he overtly announced a true project of society that consists in eliminating any deviating ideology or philosophy that are, according to him, incompatible with what he calls Republican values. And so those Republican values are basically incompatible with Islam. And they were also eager to eliminate the CCIF because we won a lot of legal battles. And we reestablished the rights of the Muslims through using the very French laws. And above all, we teach the Muslims, we teach the French Muslims on their rights. And it scares the government to have educated Muslims in France. And all of this combined to the fact that we are Muslims. We are ourselves Muslims, and so we are racialized people that fight for our rights. We were perceived as a threat, a national threat, like they say, a Muslim threat, empowering all the Muslims. But the reality is that today nobody can turn a blind eye on the fact that the dissolution of the CCIF took part of a political conspiracy to control the Muslims, their institutions, and their mind through a real witch hunt.
Thank you, Shafika, so much. At this point, we will again move forward. Asim, to you and our next speaker.
Linda. So I was going to bring Dr. Sami in at this stage, but actually Brother Mazem has to leave us. So I've just asked him to just share a couple of words with us, Dr. Sami, if that's okay with you, just before he leaves, because unfortunately he has another event he has a conflict with. So please, Brother Mazem, Jazakallah khair.
Thank you very much indeed. Listening to everybody, in particular, all of you, there's a very powerful story about Islamophobia, and it is painful that this spans a period of 2 decades, 20 years of Islamophobia. At its best, it's the targeting of Muslims through various institutions, and at its worst, it's actual murder. And this is what I wanted to come to really, because one of the things that I witnessed in Bagram was murder. I saw 2 people, including one person whose hands were tied above the top of his cage, and his head was hooded, being beaten to death by American soldiers. And I saw another prisoner who tried to escape, also beaten to death by American soldiers. What prompted me to say this, of course, is that I did hear the screams of a woman in Bagram that at one point I was led to believe was my wife, my own wife, being tortured. And it wasn't my wife, but it was somebody's wife, it was somebody's mother, it was somebody's daughter, it was somebody's sister. I know that for a fact. When I wrote in my book that I had tried to find out through the International Committee of the Red Cross who this woman was, I eventually came to the conclusion that it may have been Prisoner 650, I'm not sure completely. because there's just some issues about the timing of when I was there and when Afia could have been there. But I know for sure there was a prisoner 650 there, because prisoners who escaped from Bagram actually related in detail this story. And why this is important to me is because people know about Guantanamo, people know about this place because it's become this kind of ugly picture in the war on terrorism. But there was an underbelly, a very, very dark underbelly, where the renditions program was taking place, where people were sent to secret prisons, where there was no access to any legal redress at all. There was no access. You had no right to lawyers. And that happened in the secret prisons, and that also happened in Guantanamo. And eventually, when they did give access to lawyers, it was so that prisoners could fight in court whether they had the right to habeas corpus, i.e. whether they had the right to due process. And just earlier on this year, the United States Supreme Court ruled again, a Court of Appeal ruled that the prisoners in Guantanamo have no right to due process in the case of Abdussalam Hayla in particular. This is important because when I'm listening to the other cases of Afia and Ahmed Abu Ali, and indeed Dr. Sami Al-Aryan, there's something across the board that you find that is kind of concurrent, that it doesn't really matter whether you're in Guantanamo or in the United States of America. The process and the idea of in one place, you'll get imprisonment for 14, 15, 16, 17 years without charge or trial. And in the other place, you'll get it with trial or even more, life sentences. And you have to ask for what? Victimless crimes. In all of these cases, in almost the hundreds of prisoners in Guantanamo, and even many, I mean, the multitude, the overwhelming majority in the United States of America, people going to prison for decades on end, and there is no victim. In fact, the victim is the one that is being targeted by the state. And this is what I just wanted to leave with, really, is that as somebody myself who's been subjected to torture, I didn't want to furnish all of this evening with my experience of torture, and just to suffice to say that it was that connection. I met with Afia's family when I went and visited in 2010, and I saw those children, Ahmed and Mariam, and I remember to this day the pain that was felt by everybody there, and being connected to this story that was a very global story. It spans Afghanistan and America and Pakistan and even Turkey. I have to tell you this, that one of the stop-off points for the rendition programs and people sent to Guantanamo, including myself, the planes stopped at the Incirlik Air Base in Turkey and then went on to America. So everybody is involved. This global war on terrorism, there's hardly a nation, especially in the Muslim world, that wasn't complicit in one way or the other. And that's something that we will have to contend with. So please forgive me for having to leave so early. I really wanted to listen to everybody, but I'm a prior commitment. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make you all successful and grant all of those of you who are suffering and waiting for your relatives to be released, faraj and relief quick by the mercy of Allah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Jazakallah khair, Mazen. I really appreciate those words, and I think you really set the tone for our continued discussion. Assalamu alaikum. So I've had the distinct honor of being able to introduce our final panelist for this evening, and that is Dr. Sami Al-Aryan, who is the person who's convened this whole conference in the first place. He is the director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs and Public Affairs Professor at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University. And Dr. Sami's profile is very extensive. I recommend you all go and read it in order to understand a little bit about, how much he as a person has given to this ummah, how much we have all benefited from his wisdom, from his knowledge and his expertise. He's also somebody who was a former political prisoner. And so the knowledge isn't just in what he has learned through his education, but also in the experience he's had as somebody who has not only been imprisoned by America as an imperial power, but also somebody who fought it and beat it too. That is crucial. We have very few heroes in the global war on terror. And I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that Dr. Samuel Arian is one of them, without any doubt in my mind, at least anyway. And so I'm not going to give Dr. Sami's full bio because, as I said, it's quite extensive, but just to introduce him to say that, you know, he's somebody that I admire a great deal. Please, Dr. Sami, the floor is yours.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you so much, Asim, for these kind words, and thank you everybody for being on this panel. I feel your pain. I know these stories inside out. I was on solitary confinement, and I was wondering, you know, what the community is doing for these things. And then I was on a house arrest for many years, and I had the time actually to go and read these stories and know them and feel, you know, for the families. So this panel is very important. It's part, obviously, intellectual, but part emotional as well. The story here, in a nutshell, is the story of being targeted. And my particular one, we were not targeted in 2001 or after 9/11, actually. We were targeted long before. And we were targeted because of our activism, particularly for Palestine. It turns out that we were being monitored by pro-Israeli groups for many years. And back in '94, we had some run-ins, and even before that with some of these people. So we were always on the radar screen. In America, when you are a professor, a tenured professor, it's one of the most difficult things to get you fired, unlike other places. And because I was tenured, they tried, you know, for many years to get me fired from the university, and they were not able to. But even with all the pressure they were trying to apply, I was suspended for a couple of years, and then I was, you know, put back in, and there was an investigation after investigation within the university, and actually the reports that came back were pretty positive. In fact, they were praising our work at the university. Even though my field was engineering, you know, we also had other activities which dealt with, you know, these world conflicts, particularly Israel-Palestine, and you know, these reports were pretty positive towards our work. At any rate, we were targeted. I was targeted afterwards, and it reached at the highest levels of politicians because, again, I was very involved in another battle called secret evidence, in which we were prevailing, actually. We were able to free everybody, stop that practice. We were at the cusp of banning it from Congress. So this was a high-profile campaign. But at the same time, of course, the other side was losing that campaign, because on the other side was also the pro-Israeli groups. But after 9/11 also, they took advantage, and they tried to push hard within the administration, and because of the bias that existed within the university, but they couldn't do it legally because, again, I was tenured. So they tried several maneuvers, and then it became a national case of trying to fire a tenured professor. So the issue about academic freedom of speech, and all that. So the only thing that was left to them is criminal charges, you know, which came with a ton of bricks. You know, over 100 charges between me and my co-defendants, who brought in as they were really victims of that vendetta, you know, trying to get me fired. So what do? We get him, and, you know, we get him charged. Then it would be easy to fire him. We put him there. We silence him. It's the case about silencing you. But with that, they had, you know, they couldn't find evidence, so they have to invent a conspiracy. That's exactly what happened. To have a conspiracy, you cannot conspire with yourself. You have to conspire with other people. So they brought 3 other people, which you know, was very sad, because they disrupted 4 families, and how many children? Was over 25 children, I think, and families were totally, their lives were upside down for many years. At the end of and of course we had to go through all the different, you know, Guantanamo plus, you know, stuff. I call it Guantanamo plus in the positive side, because you have all these restrictions on you, and all the media, you know. The day I was brought in a helicopter to the, you know, for the arraignment. You know, they had snipers everywhere. They have police cars, and, you know, so, you know, I don't know if they had a tank or something. It was a military style, you know, in order to scare everybody and get. And in the day of the trial, also they have all these things around, all these military measures to scare the jury. At any rate, after 43 months on solitary confinement, after 6 months trial, 80 witnesses. I didn't present a single witness because my lawyer thought, okay, they didn't prove your case. Why do you have even to present a witness? And they failed to convict on a single charge. And of course, they had the option. Of course, by that time, you're bankrupt. You spend what, $1.3 million on justice is very expensive, even if you get it in the United States. At any rate, we had to make a decision. You can plead to some. My lawyer said you're not gonna stay in America, so forget it. So either you leave, and I get your freedom right now, or you're gonna have another trial, and God knows what's gonna happen. But you're stuck in immigration jail because they will never let you out. This became the greatest trial. At that time, 6 months. I don't think any other trial has passed 6 months because they learned they can't have long trials. But it became the most profiled case also. So made a decision to plead something that I'm proud of what we did. Hiring lawyers for victims and bringing researchers and stuff like that. And and for that they call it crime. And we agreed that I would leave the United States. I would plead to this. Time served. You leave the United States and you give up all your rights. But it turned out that they were lying. They had another trial for me. So I had to go through another phase. And that phase stayed for another 5.5 years, mostly on house arrest. Luckily, this time we had a better judge. We had a judge who saw through the government, but again, she couldn't rule. I mean, there's a problem that judges are also intimidated by the government tactics. So because she didn't rule, the government after 5 years knew that they're not gonna have a trial. So they just dropped the case. So it was very rare victory. I mean, you call it victory because they didn't get what they were asking for, but of course they disrupted, people's lives. But we got 2 wins. And of course, within that, being in prison in solitary, I saw the inside of a US prison, and you could see the injustices that are taking place against minorities. It's horrendous. I mean, I could write a whole book just about, African-American, Latinos, and other minorities in that system and what it means, and how this is a system that within its own structure, it is designed so that it would keep the injustices going under legal precepts. I mean, it is really horrendous, and there is a lot of work, and I know that there are a lot of organizations. There are so many lessons to be learned. Perhaps we can go over some of them. I just want to say a couple of words. After I was given on house arrest, for pending the second trial, it became clear to me that the Muslim community has been put into a place where they are so intimidated that they don't want to do anything that would challenge US policies, or if they do it with trepidation. That no one was willing actually to take on all these difficult cases, our political prisoners. No one even mentions them. If someone occasionally gets acquitted, okay, everybody's going to hail that, but no one is going to approach even the families. So it became very incumbent upon us to establish an organization that can actually take on these issues, can advocate on behalf of these political prisoners. So luckily we were able to gather in 2010, I believe it was, when we gathered some of these organizations that were sporadic, throughout the United States, mostly local efforts, but we also were able to grab some national organizations, and we established the Coalition for Civil Freedoms, or initially it was called National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms, which was modeled on the previous effort against secret evidence, which was called at the time National Coalition to Protect Political Freedom. Now we're going to civil freedoms, we're even going backwards. But at the time we were able to get these, and we started this effort. Now it's been 10 years, and we still have the same problems. We have hundreds of political prisoners across the United States. Rarely anybody advocating on their behalf. The families have been traumatized, but thankfully we're able to bring them together and strengthen them and empower them. And I just want to say one thing about the injustice of the system by comparing the story of Ahmed Abu Ali, who when you hear the details of it, you're just horrified, because it could have happened to anybody. I mean, he was just a sophomore in college, you know, trying to get the future ahead of him, trying to get it, and then he is tortured at the behest of the U.S. government, and the same thing with Afia. And then because they didn't like the outcome, or they were caught red-handed torturing people, they want to cover up the torture. So what do? They charge him. The same thing with Afia. They got caught red-handed trying to kill her, so they charge her. And in this case, his charge was trying to assassinate the president of the United States. Now look at the injustice of the system, because Ahmed Ali is a person of color. You know, the government was not satisfied with 30 years. So what they do, they go and appeal and end up with life in prison. A few years after that, actually a decade after that, in 2012, there was another guy who was a veteran of the US invasion of Iraq. He was also 24, 25, something like that. His name was Timothy Joyner. And he actually was going to kill the president of the United States. At the time was President Obama. He hated blacks, he hated the president. And he actually, this was not a theory or a conspiracy. He actually went there and bought bombing materials and ammunition to the tune, with his own confession, of $87,000. He actually recruited other people who will help him to kill the president of the United States. One of them later on got cold feet, so he went there and ratted him out. He told the government about the conspiracy. The conspiracy arrested him, the government rather arrested him and charged him with the crime of trying to assassinate the president of the United States, the same crime that Ahmed was tried on. So what did he
Sorry,
get?
Dr. Sami, we just have
Yes,
to
so
up to Sister Mariam.
Right, that's what.
We can carry on.
Okay,
Sorry.
I just want to say, just want to say this, that he got 5 years.
Okay.
Ahmed got life. So this is the injustice. So that's something to think about, because he was a white person. He got 5 years, and the judge said that he was too young to get more than 5.
Sorry, just Sister Mariam unfortunately has to leave us. Jazakallah khair for joining. And I don't know if you want to say any parting words before you have to go. Sorry, you're on mute, sister.
I'm so sorry. I didn't realize I was on mute. I said I'm sorry that I have to leave. I have baby duty, but just wanted to mention that in October of 2019, the Center for Constitutional Rights filed a post-conviction habeas motion asking the court to vacate Ahmed's sentence in light of the torture, murder, and cover-up of the Khashoggi, of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi, and considering the role of the mabahith in that, in the destruction of evidence and the extensive cover-up and obstruction of international investigation, and even in light of, you know, the utmost scrutiny. So unfortunately, that was denied, and so we are now, you know, back at square one. It's, you know, it's been 18 years. Ahmed was 22 at the time of his arrest, and on March 19th, he celebrated his 40th birthday. It's been his entire adult life. It's been my entire adolescence and adult life. It's just, you know, really affected our lives in every single way. So if you'll just take a moment and make dua for him, and I ask Allah to grant him freedom and justice in my parents' lifetime, and ajilan ghayra ajilan, sooner rather than later, and may Allah grant all the prisoners freedom and justice. Ameen.
Ameen ya Rab.
Take care. Assalamu alaikum.
Linda, I think the program is now back with you, inshallah.
Thank you so much. Yes, at this point, we would like to start the conversation. And I actually have one question that I would like to pose to all the panelists first, and then we'll go from there. My question is about the role of the community as a support mechanism. And as myself, I have been following just recently more closely the case of France and CCIF, also due to my position as the General Secretary of the European Forum of Muslim Women. I'm puzzled about the way how community responds to these kind of cases, especially within the, let's say, first couple of days, couple of weeks. What happens there? There was kind of I remember conversation going on online also. Shafika, maybe you remember some of that, or maybe you were aware of some of that, when folks were saying like, oh, but the French Muslims aren't doing much about this CCIF thing anyway, so why would the international Muslim community now have to basically, you know, raise their voices and so on and so forth. But also in terms of the other speakers who are still here, I would like to ask you, how did you find the support of the community? Because I find that sometimes, and this is the sad truth, when these kind of things happen, especially when it's also with individuals, there is some kind of like a creeping suspicion that comes, you know, into the community. And also some individuals might be like afraid of being associated with those persons who are being, you know, accused at that very moment. So have you, if we start with Shafika, for example, and then the others, how did you feel? Did you feel supported, or did you feel that you were rather left alone by the community and those close to you in your circles?
Thank you, Linda. That's a really good question, because actually, I think that in the particular case of CCIF, we have been amazingly supported by the international community, by the international brothers and sisters. When we face this crisis, we would expect people from, I'm not sure that we would expect the Muslims to act and to support us collectively, because this is not something that we often see in France. We don't often see the Muslim community organizing itself and go to the street or making themselves out loud when it comes to defending their rights. But we knew that when the CCIF has been dissolved, we knew that there was this kind of fear among the Muslims, because they wouldn't have any defender left anymore. But in the first part, I think that we were largely supported by the international community. They created this amazing consortium of organization and of mosques and of random people, and they wanted to first know what exactly happens in France, because I know that when you are not within the country, sometimes it can be tricky, it can be difficult to understand what is happening. And so in the first part, we had to explain themselves, to make them kind of ambassadors of our story. And so we had to reestablish our truth, and we had to explain them how it happened, how in the very first place it happened. And it started 2 decades ago, but let's say that it really intensified from 2015 after the Charlie Hebdo's terrorist attacks and the implementation of the state of emergency. And we explained them the story. We explained them how the counterterrorism measure and counter-radicalization measures have a super great impact on Muslim communities, because at that time we recorded psychological, traumatic, financial consequences felt on both adults and children, and because the Muslims in general or in France are considered a national threat. And during the state of emergency, how to say, yeah, there were lots of searches from the police, like over 5,000 searches were done in houses of in mosques or houses of people suspected of radicalization, and the police would systematically destroy the entry door, leaving the victim to pay up for the works. Some people during the searches were held at gunpoint. We recorded lots of verbal and physical violence from the police, mocking, taunting, and racist comments during the searches. And the worst, what we had to explain to them is that those measures were not longer exceptional, because they are now enshrined in common law. They are now enshrined in common law, and also those measures were not efficient at all, because over 5,000 searches, mainly in Muslim families, just dozens of people were sentenced. And sometimes they weren't even sentenced for radicalization or terrorism reasons. They were sentenced for all the offenses. And I am heartbreaking when I heard your story. And for once, I don't wanna. I would have preferred not to speak today and just to hear and to learn from yourself, because you experience and you're still experiencing very personal stories, while I am experiencing a more collective story. But yeah, in terms of how we were supported at the international level, they became real ambassadors and they could release our counter narrative, and then step by step, I have the feeling that in France, people decided to gather and to act, because they step by step they understood that the situation went crazy, and that if the CCIF, the leading anti-racist organization with no criminal record, with they never have been convicted for anything, and we have been randomly dissolved. So I think that it triggered the fact that the Muslim community started organizing themselves, and yeah.
Thank you, Shafika. Dr. Sami or Dr. Fauzia, would you like to also address this question from the perspective of your own stories?
Fauzia, go ahead.
Dr. Sami, please.
Well, part of the government tactic is to strip that support, that community support, from the person who's being targeted. So what do? In my case, of course, they went and visited maybe every single family in the neighborhood in the mosque, which gives a chilling effect. And sometimes we even go further than what the government intends. So there was this huge fear, and it was in the background. It's not just in my case, I think in every other case. That's why most of these cases are never discussed in the mosques. They don't, except there are very few exceptions, they don't bring and organize support groups. When we were dealing with secret evidence, we were going and educating the community about the need to do this, and a lot of them were supportive. But when it came after 9/11, with the FBI basically doubling its man force and even splitting and going very aggressively against these communities, it created this huge fear within the community, and a lot of them, of course, they just backed off. But luckily for us, because of the secret evidence campaign, we had really established a lot of connections with non-Muslim groups who didn't have this background, and they didn't, they more understood, because when you're talking about first generation immigrant community, where they come from authoritarian regimes and they come from repressive societies, becomes very difficult for them to understand what freedoms they have. They start putting actual restrictions where none exist. But when you're dealing with indigenous communities, non-Muslim communities, well, they're not particularly targeted, and they start organizing around the case, it gives it even more more support. You know, in my case, I think one of the again, this is just my own reflection. Probably one of the positive things that happened in my case that didn't happen in the other cases is that we had a large non-Muslim community coming and demonstrating in front of the courthouse almost on a daily basis. These were non-Muslims. And when the jury sees non-Muslims coming, demonstrating with banners and with vocal and talking to the media, they start acting, but this is not his community. This is not people who are coming to defend him. These are other people, so they must know something that we don't. Most of other cases didn't have that. So the fact that you reached out and you were known within other communities did help. Unfortunately, I didn't know this at the time, is that our community also, you know, had chilling effect. So even the families were affected. You know, my family particularly was affected. Even some of, you know, they felt alienated. Of course, that changed after we won our case, and people started, you know, becoming more vocal and more supportive. But for a while, you know, for 2.5 years before the case went to trial, and we actually went to trial, they felt alienated, they felt unloved and unsupported, even within the mosque and the school that we established. So, you know, and I'm going back and talking to many family members after that, and I saw that this is across the nation, that many of the families feel abandoned, feel that they have been basically left behind, that a lot of the national organizations have not supported them. And I think that's why they appreciate the efforts of the coalition, because it went the other way. But it is part, you know, it's at the government step. The government creates this atmosphere of fear and intimidation. You know, I remember one of the, you know, before even 9/11, you know, when the secret evidence, he said, why you're not supportive? You know, they said, you know, if the government puts its sight on you, I mean, you're toast, because they, you know, if the government's going to go and investigate, you know, I've noticed that in my discovery, there isn't anything that you can think of that they didn't go and investigate. You know, anything for things that are very, very obvious that you haven't anything to do with it. They go and investigate, trying to find something wrong. I said, if anybody is focused on, they're going to bring him, you know, on taxes, on anything. So you know, it's the government has enormous power, and when they want to deploy them against certain people, certainly. But the only response is not to hide, but the only response is to empower the community and organize and mobilize.
Thank you, Dr. Sami. Yes, I remember hearing your story from before, and especially this aspect of forming alliances and getting supported by not only Muslims. That shows that these issues are not Muslim issues necessarily; they are human rights issues, right? So it's very powerful. Dr. Fauzia, how has your experience been in terms of community support or support from non-Muslim communities?
As far as Afia's case goes, it resonates with the people. Unfortunately, in the US, though it's kind of strange that when I'm out there and if I'm talking to anyone to my face, no one ever, you know, everyone's very apologetic and very sympathetic, and this is our sister and we are with you and call us anytime. But I think that there is a lot of fear. I think there are two factors in these cases in general, in all our victims, and one is fear and one is favor. So our rulers don't help us, our elite don't help us, because they want to do favors and they want favors. And the public with whom it resonates, who feel our pain as if it's their own pain, they are given this big fear. You know, with all these thousands of missing people in Pakistan, I mean, everyone, if we speak for this person, maybe we'll be the next missing person, we'll be the next number in that. And that hasn't stopped. And that fear is great. But I find in Pakistan still, despite all that fear, there are millions who have, I mean, I don't think that I could have survived these 18 years if it wasn't for the support of the people, of the general community in general. They would come, they come on the 2nd of March when it's Hafia's birthday. They bring flowers. They just come with one flower in their hand, a small card. Some will come with a small cake. I mean, I'm sure if I counted the number of cakes that people brought, it would be in Guinness Book of World Records. But that love and that support, if I go out anywhere, I mean, granted, my kids say we have no privacy if we go out with you. But on the other hand, there are people who just stare, but most of the women would come and just say, can we just hug you? We're sorry we can't do anything, but we do pray for you. And that is the thing. I think that Afia is still alive. There was not, I don't know how we could have survived this. I mean, you can't imagine the pain. You've got to realize that when someone dies, when someone you love dies, you get a kind of sabr. You get some patience. It just comes with closure. There's a closure. But in these cases, for no crime, for nothing, you know, the only news you get is bad or worse. No contact. It's like you die every day. You go through the process, the pain of losing someone every single day. And that's very painful. And if it weren't for community support, it wouldn't happen. But again, we need united. We need a united community support. And unfortunately, we're not. I mean, the large organizations, they don't want to help out. They don't want to speak out for Afia's case. They don't want to speak out for anybody's case who is involved in any of these rendition operations or any Islamophobia operations, because they're afraid that their organizations will come into scrutiny. The leaders, the elite, they're afraid that their factories, they don't want to donate, they don't want to help because they're afraid that their factories might come into scrutiny. The fear factor. And it reminds me of that hadith that we all forget when our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that there will be a time when Muslims will be many in number, yet they will be suppressed and they will be oppressed. And when the Sahaba asked that, why would that be? Is it because we were few? He would say, no, you would be more than I don't know how to say it in English, but anyway, you'd be in the millions. But it's the love of your things, hubbija, and the fear of death that's going to make you weak. And I think that's where we are at right now. That's my personal experience and feeling.
No, Jazakumullah khair, Sister Fawzia. You know, such a moving and poignant reminder to us all. And actually, it leads me into my question perfectly, because I have, you know, listening to all of you, I came away with a question in my mind about the precariousness of our belonging to whatever nation we live in. I mean, Dr. Sami's a Palestinian, like he already knows from a family perspective, the precariousness of having an identity that's attached to a homeland or to a state. I mean, like when I think about Mazen being betrayed by the UK, Ahmed Abu Ali, you know, he's in a situation where no one wants to claim him, no one wants to represent his rights, because we've attached the idea of gaining our rights directly to a state. Shafiqa, of course, in your case, you know, it's the state that's directly oppressing you. They're the ones who are saying that, well, actually, you don't belong. Like, the only way we'll allow you to belong is if you look exactly like us, if you sound exactly like, if you believe exactly like us. Dr. Sami, you were sent to Turkey. And, you know, of course, in your case, Dr. Fawzia, you know, there is the claim of Afia being the daughter of a nation. And yet when it comes to actual policy making at the highest levels, then, you know, it's almost like this is the daughter we don't want to talk about, you know.
Exactly.
So it just leads me to this idea of, you know, how often in our activism we attach gaining our rights to the nation state itself, that the state is the thing that's going to grant us. But where does that leave us? And this is my question to you: where does it leave us when the state itself and all structures of all states are responsible, are complicit in the production of the abuse that we suffer? Yeah, so anyway, it was just a thought that I had, like, listening to you all speak. So I don't know who wants to go first. Maybe Dr. Sami this time.
Well, certainly nationalism has been the strongest force globally since at least the 19th century. And of course, it was manifested in the nation state system, which is dominating now. I mean, we can't get around this. This is a fact of life, that today, you know, you have a system, international system based on the nation state. And within that nation state, you have different political systems. One of the most prominent certainly is a democratic government with particular rights and privileges and responsibilities and duties for its citizens. And then within these rights, people start talking now in terms of whether you have human rights or civil rights or political rights or what have you. And if you don't have a nation, you don't have a state like Palestinians, then you're denied pretty much. The same can go, but also within that, you know, if you go to the United States, one of the greatest, so-called greatest democracies on the face of the earth, you'll find that the millions have been disenfranchised within its system, particularly African Americans and others. So it's not a clear-cut thing. I mean, there's a macro level, there's a micro level. But when it comes to the issues we're talking about here, where you are a targeted community, a minority, and this, by the way, could be within Muslim majority or Muslim minority countries. I mean, today, if you live in some of these so-called Muslim majority countries, if you are particularly a person with an ideological bent on Islamic values or Islamic outlook, then you're targeted. And if you're targeted, you don't even have some of these small protections that you may enjoy in Western societies, even though you've been targeted. One of the things that went for me, you know, being targeted in the United States is one thing, but you still have certain certain rights that you can rely on. You know, you still have the ability to actually mount a defense. But if my case was one of these, you know, Arab countries, I've been told, you know, there is nothing here to rely on. I mean, if you're targeted, you're done. This is it for you. So, I'm grateful that at least I had 12 people, you know, a jury that can look at the case and decide for themselves, even with all the intimidation and all the, you know, this is a trial that cost at least $100+ million. I mean, they put everything, you know, in order to get me behind bars, and it didn't work because you still had to go through the system. So even with that nation state system that we don't particularly think it's going to give you all the rights, you still have certain elements in it that we are grateful for. I'm grateful for the fact that you had some constitutional protections that you don't have in Guantanamo. We just finished one session in which we talked about that this is how Guantanamo is different from those who will have trials within the continental United States with certain constitutional rights and protections. And thankfully, luckily, we had it. You know, unfortunately, there are other examples. I mean, Afia is one of them. The Holy Land is other, and we can go on and on and on with different. Ahmed Abu Ali and others. Is that the system will not always work. But if you are in a country where you really have no respect for law, you really have no protections, you have repressive regimes, you have an authoritarian regime that can dictate what the judges would do or say, then you have zero chance of getting out. And we've seen this in country after country after country. it's very, when I hear what's going on in France, it's really very tragic that, even though it happened in the United States, that they closed down these charities and that they went after them, they froze their accounts and all kinds of things, and all kinds of repressive laws, called anti-terrorism laws that actually go and target people, and sometimes target them because of what they think, who they associate with, not just because of something they did. And I think what's happening in France is even one step further, it's even worse. Same this concept of pre-crime, that you look like this, then that you must have, done this, or you may think about doing this, and therefore we're going to close you down with nothing. It's so we really have to band together, and we have to fight this. Now, we can fight this in the global, not necessarily nationally. And I believe this is something that is lacking. We need to build this worldwide movement when we can come together. You don't have to be actually for a particular ideological line here or bent, because if you're targeted by the state, if the state doesn't like what you say, it doesn't matter what your faith is, you're going to be targeted. And I saw this back in the late 90s before the Good Friday Agreement, where the Irish groups were being targeted the same way the Muslim groups were targeted. So I think that's what we need. We need a worldwide movement in which we can face and stand up to government, heavy-handedness, stand up to government tactics where they're trying to curtail your rights. And I think this is something that, from my own experience, at least before 9/11, that it worked. We were able to bring together 40 organizations and fight the use of secret evidence, even though it was applied against Muslims. For the most part, 28 out of the 29 cases that we were able to track down were of Muslims. But we knew that this is not going to stop there. You're this favorite, you're not favorite group. Okay, no one is going to care about you. They get you, they establish the practice, then they can move to other targets. We were able to convince many organizations who are not Muslim that they need to be a part of this because you could be next. And they actually agreed. And I think the same thing happens in France and other European countries and other countries around the world. And a lot of people now are beginning to see, after what they've seen the past 20 years of the so-called war on terror, that this is not going to stop. This is going to target everybody, and therefore we cannot be deceived by this national attitude. And I think that requires a particular kind of leadership that is able to see beyond the ideology and beyond the self interest, and to see this as a human rights issue rather than as a simple religious issue.
Thank you. Dr. Fawzia, would you like to comment on this?
Brother Asim, I kind of agree what Dr. Sami said. I mean, it's the same everywhere. And I founded the Afia movement just because of this, that we Muslims have actually, we've just divided ourselves into so many different sects. We're so divided, we're so scattered that, the unity, the being one body, feeling each other's pain, uniting for each other, that whole concept has just gone. I mean, it's either you're a Shia, you're a Sunni, you're a Barelvi, you're a Deobandi, you're a God knows what sect and what sect. There are so many. Just here in Pakistan, I could count you out with. And then it's just not just that. Then there's this whole racialism. Like just in Pakistan, there's Sindhi, there's Balochi, every province is different. And then you're a Kurd, you're an Arab, so you're an Arab that speaks with this particular dialect, so you're not one of us. And that is, I think, our problem. And if we would just unite, and I really felt with our history, given our history and everything, that probably Afia is that linchpin. That, maybe that is why, because I keep thinking, why Afia? And, Afia and a lot of others were like her, is that linchpin that, we forget for just a brief moment, we forget our differences and we unite for one simple cause. Just one sister, we unite for her. Once we're united, then we will have united for ourselves. And that is the only time that our salvation will start to happen. I mean, I've always believed that. I still do believe that. And I will keep trying. And I don't know how successful I'll be, but at least I can go down and die saying that I tried.
Inshallah. Inshallah, you know, all your efforts will be, you know, kind of rewarded in this life and in the hereafter. I mean, I have no doubt about that. We will see Afia free one day, inshallah.
Inshallah. I want to ask Brother Asim also, Dr. Asim, if you can reflect also on some of these cases in the United Kingdom. How, from that perspective, do you see things better or are they the same?
Yeah, and thank you, Dr. Sami.
In terms of the victims, in terms of the victims of
Yeah,
this
no,
so-called-
it's a very difficult one to really quantify. I think in my practice, what I've tried not to do is develop a sliding scale of oppression, because everyone's case is contextual to what their circumstances and their experience in life is. For some of my clients, the very worst thing that ever happened to them ever in the entirety of their family's life, their life, was being stopped at an airport and being asked questions about their belief. Like, if you speak to these people, they will speak to you almost in the same vernacular as somebody who's been through a regime of torture, because their life was built with a certain expectation of the way the world should look in mind. And so when they experience these things, the devastation of that in their life actually it remodels them in a way that they never expected. It changes their physiology, it changes their psychology in very, very damaging ways. And so, you know, that's the thing about the global war on terror, that what we have never been able to adequately quantify is the deep and the long-term impact that even something as simple like being stopped in the street or being stopped at an airport can have on that person. Because we see waterboarding and we take that as the starting point of like what oppression looks like, then everything else after that just seems to vanish away into nothingness. But the reality is that for hundreds of thousands, and we're talking about actually really millions of Muslims, they experience violence on a daily basis. But we normalize that violence by, you know, by turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that helps, our faith helps. It helps us to overcome things to a certain degree. But we also normalize it by accommodating that violence in our lives. So we know that we're going to get stopped at the airport. So instead of turning up to the airport 3 hours in advance of our flight, we turn up to the airport 5 hours in advance. What we don't say is we should stop the system that is oppressing us. What we do is we just accommodate it by walking around the edges of that oppression all the time. And that, I think, is the saddest part of the story of the global war on terror, the way in which Muslims have accommodated violence into their lives in manifold ways, in everyday ways, in minute by minute ways. And we won't see the real effects of that, I don't think, until our children's generation, when we have this 9/11 generation who only ever knew of being securitized, who only ever knew of being problematized by politicians, by the media, by policemen, by judges, by every single institution that they are forced to encounter. I mean, how do we truly quantify one of our cases in Cage, where a boy who's got a problem with his leg goes in to see his doctor and the doctor asks him his opinion on ISIS? Like, how do we truly quantify the violence of that moment and the fact that this child, his relationship to the medical profession has been profoundly changed by the way his doctor has been taught to act as a spy for the global war on terror? Like, these things are impossible for us to really, I think, understand in their full complexity. And that's why I don't mean to push back on you, Dr. Sami, in the sense that I don't think it was an appropriate question, but I just don't think that we've really come to terms with the full complexity of, and that's why this conference is so amazing, because we get a snapshot through all of this expertise that we've seen over the last few days, giving us insights into all of the layers of Islamophobia. Like an onion, we're kind of unpeeling it bit by bit by bit, but there's always more. This is a never-ending onion. Like every single time we uncover a layer, there's just another layer sitting right underneath it. And I'm afraid that like we'll be talking about this and really trying to think through for a very long time. And even when the war on terror ends, we still have to live with the consequences of that. And that hasn't been reckoned with yet at all. So yeah, sorry for not really answering your question, maybe as you might have liked.
You're perfect. I was wondering about Norway also, if there's anything Linda could share with us. Are there any of these examples in Norway, particularly after this guy who massacred 88 people, and they were all non-Muslims, and it was the way, I mean, he ended up, I mean, it's amazing. Somebody kills, I mean, this isn't the US, it's unheard of. Somebody killed 88 people and he ended up with 22 years. Yeah. And someone who was tortured, he ends up with life. I mean, it's just amazing, you know, how and, you know, and people obviously, they just, you know, they hear the name Ahmed Abu Ali and they just pass by like there's nobody. And here's a guy who was taken at that young age, tortured for 47 days. You know, they get a confession out of him under torture. And then the system knows this. It's not like they didn't. I mean, the FBI fully knows, and they were witnesses to his torture, trying to get something out of him. And when they were caught by the judge, you know, and pressed by the judge to answer these difficult questions, what do? They run, you know, forward by charging him, and getting 30 years wasn't satisfactory. So they go and get her life. So it's amazing. So tell us a little bit about Norway, Linda, if you may.
Dr. Sami, I have to disappoint you. I don't have that many insights on Norway since I'm from Finland, remember?
Right. Yeah, I know, but I thought maybe you would know something about, since the societies are similar.
Yes. So I
didn't mean to say that you're from Norway. I just thought that you have some insights.
No, I haven't been actually also too much following on recent developments in Norway since Breivik's case, of course, because that was something very, very famous. But what's been happening obviously in the north and in Scandinavia generally is that, and it's been also recognized elsewhere in Europe, mostly in Germany, I'd say this rise in the violence committed by the far right? And obviously Breivik was from the far right scene, as was also the massacre of the Christchurch. But the Finnish intelligence security police, they have just released a new report on you know, national threats, or what they call terrorist threats. And in that report, yes, they obviously, as they have to, and I mean it sarcastically kind of, go on the Islamic side of it, on these threats. But they actually very much also emphasize at the moment the threat from the far right. And I think this is a positive, it's a positive development, that the discourse is it's changing, okay? And I think that slowly also the wider public is getting a better picture of what's going on. But however, of course, still Muslims are being demonized in our countries as well. And it's not long time ago that we had our own cases of individuals being accused of certain things that they hadn't actually done. And it destroyed also lives and families and communities, to be honest. I was just wondering if also Shafika had any experiences regarding that question on belonging, because as Asim mentioned in Shafika's and CCIF's case, it is the state that directly attacked the organization. And I remember Macron's comments, and how it was like as if CCIF was made a showcase of that bigger project of a fight against Islamism, right? And in terms of what I was also myself thinking was that when you are put in that kind of a situation where the state just like absolutely goes against you and you are powerless, right? If we think about those other cases of our brothers and sisters who have been through torture, who have been to prison that we have also heard of today, how do you kind of preserve that hope in the system and the trust in the system? Because that's, or do you actually lose the hope? This is something that I have been also personally wondering about. So if you, Shafika, can comment a little bit on these.
Yes, yeah. Actually, yes, we are shocked. We are, we don't understand what is happening, because we don't understand how overnight we become basically terrorists. How human rights defender can suddenly be portrayed as a national threat, as an enemy of the Republic, and you would switch on your TV and you would hear about the CCIF nonstop, and you being an activist at the CCIF, you wouldn't feel safe anymore, because you're like, okay, first, I'm a woman. Second, I wear the veil. And third, I live in France. And with this profile, you know that when you go out in the street with this rise of the far right movements, you don't feel safe. But now you tell yourself that, okay, if people know, or if people recognize that I am from the CCIF, and the media and the government currently is telling on live, on air, 24 hours that those people, the people were, they are threats for you guys. They are threats for the security of the French territory. So we felt very, very insecure. I remember that we couldn't go anymore in our offices, because we didn't know what could happen, and so from a personal level, it is very frustrating to live this, to experience this situation. But there's also a feeling of fear, and this feeling of fear is created by our government. The government, the country in which we are supposed to live, the country from which we are supposed to belong. And to come back to your question about nationality, it's a very crucial question, because actually we know that, at least in France, before being a Muslim issue, before being Islamophobia, it was an Arab issue, because most of the Muslim population in France comes from Arab countries, and part of them comes from Turkey. So it was an Arab issue. Then it became a Muslim issue, a religious issue, and taking into account as, okay, for example, I have 3 nationalities, and taking into account that I am a Muslim in France, and I know I will never be supported by my government as long as I don't sign or I don't agree with the principles that are present in the Charter of Islam of France. So basically, the French government has drafted a Charter of Islam of France, and this charter is supposed to define an Islam of the Enlightenment. And the government wants the CFCM. So basically, the CFCM is the French Muslim Council, and it is supposed to represent the French Muslims, but it does only represent itself. The Muslims in general don't feel represented by the CFCM, because it's an organ that has been created during the government of Sarkozy to control Islam, to control the Muslims, to control their behavior, their mind. And it is, the problematic is that it's their only interlocutor. It's the state interlocutor when it comes to Islam and when it comes to the Muslims. And so we don't have the floor to defend our own rights, because we are defended by an organization which is ready to sign a charter that states that the rules of the Republic, the rules of the French Republic, are superior to the rules of Allah. And then taking into account that we don't agree with the Islam of France, we know that we can be threatened every moment of being withdrawn our nationality, of our French nationality, if the French government considers ourselves to be radicalized. But when you take into account the definition of the radicalization presented by the former Minister of Interior, Castaner, when you hear that if you are growing a beard, or if you wear the hijab, or if you pray 5 times a day, if you go regularly to the mosque, and particularly during Ramadan, if suddenly you change your way of you change your clothes and you go for abaya, traditional Arab or Muslim clothes, you can potentially be a radicalized person. And when you know that your own government call for the population to denounce the persons that potentially fit this description, and you see that you fit this description, how can you have any confidence in the state? So yeah, naturally you think of your second, third nationality, and you tell yourself, Alhamdulillah, I have a second nationality or third nationality. It's like a way out, just in case. And this is the way we are conditioned to think when we are a Muslim in France. And typically, when there is a crime, when a crime is committed by a French, by an Arab, but before, I don't know, but he's a French, but when a crime is committed and if he got a double nationality, then they wouldn't speak about his French or their French nationality. They would speak about their foreign nationality. It's a cycle that is established for a while in France. And when we see the measures, and especially the measures that are contained in the bill against separatism, when we see that the bill is overtly Islamophobic, even though they try to use a kind of neutral language, but by not directly naming or pointing to the Muslims, by using the expression places of worship instead of directly using the word mosques. When you see that they enlarge the reasons for dissolution of associations of mosques, when they enlarge the reason for closure of Muslim schools, of Muslim establishments, when they enlarge the reasons of when you see that the definition of radicalization, the definition of terrorism, the definition of extreme violence is so vague that you can yourself being encompassed in this definition, then you have no other choice than telling yourself that eventually, ultimately, at some point, you will need your double nationality, and you will have to flee your own country, because we know. Because first, we are at some point we are disgusted of hearing the same media hype, demonization, criminalization of the Muslims and of the Muslims NGO. And second, we know that the justice is unfair, the justice is biased, and we know that at the moment we are integrated into the process of radicalization at the moment that the state accuses us of being radicalized, of being terrorists, of creating terrorism or paving the way of terrorism in France, we know that it's over for us.
Right.
We can't get rid of our guilt. Because in France, at the moment, the burden of proof is reversed, and it's not to the now it's to the victim to prove they are not a victim.
No, Jazakallah khair for sharing that, and it actually really summarizes so perfectly why I asked that question in the first place. It's deeply worrying how little protection actually we have, and as Dr. Sami rightly pointed out, that even if we do leave, where do we go? To what other types of lacks of protection ultimately? Because the Islamophobia is reproduced in so many ways in so many places. And so that's why it requires, I think, probably more innovative responses. This has been an amazing few days. I just want to invite, as we close up, the speakers to maybe just give 1 minute closing remarks each, inshallah, before we end what has been, yeah, as I said, an amazing conference. So maybe Dr. Sam, if we start with you, then go to Dr. Fawzi, and then end up with Shafiqa.
I'll end. I need to.
Okay, you save yours for the end. Okay, that's fine. Shafiqa, why don't we stick with you then, going first, and then Dr. Fawzi, and then Dr. Sami can end then, inshallah.
Okay, I just want to thank all of you, all of the panelists, all of the victims of the war on terror. You know, usually I am used to participate to this kind of panels, this kind of conference, and I would describe the measures in France. I would describe how horrible is the situation in France. But today I was almost ashamed to take the floor, because your stories are so hurtful, they are so striking, and they are so personal. You're like, at the CCIF, I used to be a defender of the Muslims, and I can't say that I have ever been a victim, and I would deal with victims, but now I just hear real stories of I'm facing your stories, and it's just, I don't know, it's just it's just very hard. This discussion was very hard to handle. It was very hard. I just want to thank all of you from the bottom of my heart, and inshallah, like Dr. Fauzia, you said, we all have to stay united. We need the community, the Muslim community, to stay united, and there is lots of hope. And yes, just thank you.
Ms. Shafiqa, thank you very much. I just repeat some of Ms. Shafiqa's words. I just want to thank all of you, and especially Dr. Sami Aliarian. He's always raised issues that people are afraid to raise, and Islamophobia is one of them. And it is something that needs a constant hammering. It means getting off and on. I've been traveling, so but it's been very, very that you included me in this and gave me a voice, and to all of you panelists, it was my pleasure and my honor, and it's a much needed thing for which I commend you all. Thank you very, very much.
Dr. Sami, please.
First, I want to thank you, Asim and Linda, for co-moderating this important session. I want to thank also all the my brothers and sisters who participated in this and telling us their stories. For the past few days, we've had this deep discussion, which I'm not aware of any other conference that actually went deep into this discussion about the different aspects of the so-called war on terror. So I'm very proud that we were able to host this at the center. I'm also very thankful to our co-sponsors, Hamad bin Khalifa University, the Afro Middle East Center, CAGE, and Coalition for Civil Freedoms, along with Istanbul Zaim University. I'm very thankful for all their efforts, for their co-sponsorship, for their involvement. I also want to thank all our speakers and moderators for bringing very profound discussions and ideas into this 5 days. We've had about 19 hours. So we will have 19 hours of recordings for people to actually go listen to, reflect upon. And I hope that we can continue this conversation, because we just scratched the surface about the different aspects of this so-called war on terror, which hasn't, believe it or not, I mean, the United States today, it invaded Afghanistan in October 2001. Today, in 2021, and they are about to, announce whether or not they will withdraw. So we're talking about a situation where millions of people have been affected. So hopefully we will continue this discussion. I also want to thank, before we end this, our staff who worked very hard in bringing this together. Yunus Akdeniz, who is the Assistant Director for Administration, who was working behind the scenes, tying many knots. I want to thank Taimur bin Tanvir, who is the Technical Director of all these sessions that you have seen. I also want to thank our staff who have been in front of the camera as well as behind: Ubaid Rauf, Owais Khan, Fadi Zatari, Jalal Al-Khushaib, Saima Rashid, Mariam Khan, Abdullah Jurat, Yumna Sulaiman, Omar Fili, Taqwa Nidal, Mihraj Bhat, Roshan Humayun, and our interns, Sahar Sadiq, Isra Ibrahim Mughlo, Berat Karadiniz, and Salman Nugraha. All of them and others have been working behind the scenes, trying to bring the best conference that we could virtually. So I want to thank all of them. And I promise that we will continue our efforts here at CIGA, along with our partners, to bring these difficult issues. We will have a special program also in Ramadan. It will be a 1 hour every day at 5:30. Stay tuned for the details of it. Ramadan is about in a couple of weeks. So we don't stop here. We continue working. Thank you very much, everybody. And I hope to see all of you soon. Thank you, Asim, again, and thank you, Linda.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Sami. Assalamu alaikum.